Hello and welcome back to another video. This video is going to be part 2 of the American Presidents series. So if you haven't seen that one, I'll put a link. It's a good place to probably start. You don't have to start there, but you could, because I do Presidents 1 through 5. And today I'll be covering Presidents 6 through 10. And the first one that we start off with, number 6, is going to sound somewhat familiar because we met his dad in the first part. President number 6 is John Quincy Adams. Like his dad, John Quincy Adams is from Massachusetts, and he served from 1825 to 1829. He also worked for all 5 previous presidents. Some of the titles that he held was ambassador to Russia. So think about it, Russia, far off today from the United States, but even further away back then. And he was really young when he first started going overseas with his father, John Adams. So by the time he was 18, he had spent more time away from the United States than he did inside the United States. He was the Secretary of State for President James Monroe. And when you think about people in power, he was 4th in line to become president. Secretary of State is 4th in line to become president. But unfortunately, like his father, he also only served 1 term. And his time while president was probably the least successful part of his life. He was much more successful before he became president and after he became president. So while we might not talk too much about him as president, he will come back in 2 presidents from now, and we will talk about him then. But one of the reasons he wasn't a successful president was how he became president. And that was in a very close race with Andrew Jackson, the 7th president. But when John Quincy Adams became president, it had the vote. He didn't win enough in the popular vote, so it had to go to Congress and they would vote. And it seemed like he might have made a deal with somebody in Congress that made it so Andrew Jackson wouldn't be president when maybe he should have been president. So that was later called the corrupt bargain, and not a lot of people took John Quincy Adams seriously while he was president. So after John Quincy Adams left the presidency, he actually went into Congress and served there for 18 years. And for those 18 years, he was an abolitionist, which is a fancy word to say that he was against slavery. He wanted to abolish slavery. And like I said, even though we are leaving him as president, it is not the last time we will talk about him in this video. President number 7 is Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. He served from 1829 until 1837. So he did have 2 terms, unlike John Quincy Adams, who only served 1. Now, of the 5 presidents in this video, Andrew Jackson is by far the most powerful and the best remembered. Although, as time goes by, there is more and more controversy to his presidency, because we will eventually talk about the Trail of Tears, a very embarrassing and unfortunate time in American history. So since he was from Tennessee, think about it, that was like the Wild West of the United States at the time. And he is thought to be the first common man to become president. He was not one of the founding fathers. He was not one of the sons of the founding fathers. He was more like a common man. He rose through the military, much like George Washington did, but Jackson was a bit rougher around the edges. He wasn't as polished as someone like George Washington, and he certainly didn't have as much money as George Washington. Andrew Jackson became famous in a battle called the Battle of New Orleans, in a war called the War of 1812, which if you see part 1 of this video, I talk a little bit about. But he won the Battle of New Orleans after the War of 1812 actually ended. But remember, back then it took a long time for news to get from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. So in the time that the war had ended, the battle was fought and won by Andrew Jackson. His nickname was Old Hickory, and hickory is a really tough type of wood. He was so tough that he actually joined the army during the Revolutionary War when he was only 13 years old. But let's now get into the controversial part of his presidency. So he was responsible for the Indian Removal Act, as it was called back then, which basically said that any Native Americans living east of the Mississippi would have to move to west of the Mississippi. Now, of course, if you are a Native American living during this time, you're not going to want to get up and move halfway across the country, but that didn't matter. Many of these Native Americans were forced to march. Over 20,000 died during this. It has become known as the Trail of Tears. So in 2020, it's impossible to defend that action of Andrew Jackson. I'm not sure how anybody can hear that event from history and not say that it is terribly racist and terribly wrong. So in recent years, it has been talked about getting rid of Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill and possibly putting someone like Sacagawea there in his place. We don't have any women on our dollar bills, so maybe in the future something like that will happen. President number 8 is Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was from New York, and he served from 1837 until 1841. Sorry, because it sounds like my family is moving furniture again. Martin Van Buren's first language was not English, and he is the only president to be born to parents who did not speak English. They spoke Dutch. So his first language was actually Dutch. So again, Martin Van Buren is not going to be one of our greatest presidents, but he did not believe in abolition, which is freeing of the slaves. He only served 4 years. There was a financial crisis during his presidency, like almost a depression where people didn't have a lot of money. Businesses weren't doing very well. But he did have one major event happen while he was president, and that was the Amistad. The Amistad was a slave ship off the coast of Cuba. Now, 30 years before, in 1807, it became illegal to bring slaves into the United States. That didn't mean slavery was illegal. It wouldn't become illegal until 1865. So what happened on the Amistad was that there was a slave revolt, meaning the slaves took control of the ship, killed the captain. The ship then was sailed to the United States. But once the slaves got off the ship, they were in a bit of limbo. They were in between two cases. They weren't exactly slaves because it would have been illegal to bring them into the country as slaves, and yet they weren't exactly free. So it eventually went to court to figure out what happens to these people. Do they stay in jail? Many of them committed murder. They killed somebody. They killed the captain. Others could see, well, they did it to gain their freedom, and it didn't really happen in this country. So guess who is back? John Quincy Adams is a lawyer. He is a fierce abolitionist. He wants slavery to end. He fights for the right to release these former slaves, maybe slaves, and he actually wins. So the former slaves on the Amistad did win their freedom. Now, they weren't allowed to stay in this country. They eventually went back to Europe, but had their freedom. And all of this happened during Martin Van Buren's presidency, and he was not happy about it because he was not an abolitionist. He thought slavery should continue in this country, and it would for about another 30 years. President number 9 is William Henry Harrison, and he serves from March 4th until April 4th, 1841. If you notice, that is about 1 month. He has the shortest term of any president because he basically dies during his first month. The story is that for his speech to become president, his inaugural speech, his inauguration speech, he stayed outside, caught a cold. We know nowadays that it takes more than just being cold to catch a cold, but that's the story. And he eventually developed pneumonia, which would end up killing him. At the time, he was the oldest president ever elected at 68 years old. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s would eventually become the oldest president ever elected, and he was almost 70. But 2020, whoever gets elected, either Joe Biden, who is 77, or Donald Trump, who is 73, will become the new oldest president to ever be elected. So it's hard to talk about the William Henry Harrison presidency. So let's talk about how he became president, how he became famous. And he actually became famous much like Andrew Jackson did through his military service. And he also served during the War of 1812 and won a pretty famous battle called the Battle of Tippecanoe. Might be more fun to say than anything, but his campaign slogan to get elected was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because his running mate, who would eventually become vice president, was John Tyler. So Tippecanoe and Tyler too was the slogan that got William Henry Harrison elected president. And before we get to the last president, it's number 10, John Tyler, just want to remind you, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. You might want to ring that bell. There are a lot of days where I go live, might be on for an hour or so, and take your questions about learning English. I will leave a link to the playlist if you want to check out some of those. And I also made a new playlist for history buffs. I'll leave a link to that as well. So like I said, number 10, John Tyler. He takes over for William Henry Harrison, who dies 1 month into his presidency. So John Tyler nearly serves 4 years as president, but he does only serve that one term. He is from Virginia, so there's a theme there. Out of our first 10 presidents, so half of them are from Virginia. So when William Henry Harrison died, nobody was exactly sure who should become president. Should the next 4 years be without a president and Congress would do most of the governing? It wasn't until the 25th Amendment to our Constitution, talked about the Constitution in Part 1, that it was very clear that when the president dies in office, it's the vice president that takes over. We will talk about a few more times when the president dies in office. Now everybody knows it's the vice president that takes over. So John Tyler doesn't get as much credit as he should, in my opinion, because he was a strong personality and he said, no, I am going to become the president. Now, he wasn't without his detractors. He wasn't without people who said, no, that's not right. People did call him his Accidency because he inherited the presidency by accident, they thought. There were a lot of strong members in Congress at the time that wanted power for themselves. Congress actually tried to impeach John Tyler, and I do have a video about what impeachment means in the United States. He was never impeached. We've actually only had 3 presidents who have been impeached. That is Andrew Johnson, who we will do in a few more parts, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. So those are the three. We've only had 3 presidents who have been impeached, and John Tyler was not one of them. And even though he wasn't supposed to be president, he was an accidental president. He only served for 4 years, almost. He did get 3 major things done during his presidency. One was called the Log Cabin Bill. And this basically said that if settlers were going out west, which, remember, the United States wanted settlers to go out west. They wanted Americans to go out there so that Native Americans wouldn't claim the land. Definitely racist. But they wanted to settle the West with European descendants. So that was one thing. It did help expand this country. Another thing was, in my state of Maine, there was a border dispute between Canada and Maine, and actually some shots fired, a mini war. Well, he made it so that that war would stop. He negotiated a peace plan and helped settle the dispute between the border between Maine and the United States. And he also set in motion the ability for Texas to become a state. He got all of the things in place. Now, it wouldn't be until the next president, James K. Polk, which we will talk about in part 3, who really gets the credit for bringing Texas into the Union. But John Tyler did a lot of the hard work to set it up so James K. Polk could get credit. So not exactly our strongest 5 men who have been president. You have Jackson, who is remembered for some good things, but a lot of bad things. And you have a couple other people that probably most Americans wouldn't know. If you say the name William Henry Harrison to the typical American on the street, they might say, who? Who are you talking about? But I hope you learned a little something, maybe something you didn't know before. Hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.